What if I told you the man who built America's backbone also broke its workers' backs? That the greatest philanthropist in history was also one of its most ruthless killers? This is the Andrew Carnegie paradox, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why his story is both the ultimate success story and America's greatest moral failure. Andrew Carnegie's name adorns libraries, universities, and concert halls across the world. But beneath the marble facades and golden plaques lies a foundation built on blood, betrayal, and the broken dreams of thousands. This is the story of how a poor Scottish boy became the richest man on earth, and the terrible price humanity paid for his success. Chapter 1. The Making of a Monster. The year was 1835, and in a cramped Scottish cottage, a boy was born who would one day control more wealth than entire nations. But Andrew Carnegie's first home was a nightmare of poverty that would shape every ruthless decision he'd make for the rest of his life. 8 people crammed into a single room, sharing space, sharing air, sharing the crushing weight of hopelessness that comes with having nothing. Andrew's father, William, was a hand-loom weaver, a skilled craftsman whose expertise was about to become worthless overnight. When the Industrial Revolution brought steam-powered looms to Scotland, it didn't just change an industry, it destroyed lives. William Carnegie watched his life's work become obsolete in a matter of months. The man who once took pride in his craft was reduced to wandering the streets, hat in hand, begging for any work that would feed his family. Andrew witnessed his father weep, not from physical pain, but from the humiliation of begging for work that would never come. It was a haunting image that would stick with him forever, and perhaps explain the cold determination that would later define his business empire. While his father crumbled under the weight of industrial progress, Andrew's mother, Margaret, stepped into the void. She worked until her fingers bled, repairing shoes by candlelight, her hands moving frantically through the night to earn pennies that might keep her family alive another day. But even her superhuman efforts weren't enough. The family was drowning in poverty, and Scotland offered no lifeline. Margaret had heard stories from her sisters in America, tales of opportunity, of men rising from nothing to something. In 1848, the Carnegies made the most desperate decision of their lives. They sold everything they owned, their furniture, their clothes, even their family Bible, scraping together $20 for passage to America. It was a one-way ticket to either salvation or destruction. The ship journey across the Atlantic was brutal. Families packed like cargo in the ship's belly, disease spreading through the cramped quarters, children dying before they could see the promised land. But the Carnegies survived, and when they finally saw the shores of America, 13-year-old Andrew made a silent vow that would drive him for the next 70 years. Never again would he be powerless. Never again would he watch his family suffer. Whatever it took, whoever had to pay the price, Andrew Carnegie would never be poor again. Chapter 2. The Apprentice, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was a city of smoke and steel, a place where fortunes were made and men were broken. The Carnegie family arrived with nothing but hope and the clothes on their backs. Andrew's parents struggled to find consistent work, and it quickly became clear that if the family was going to survive, everyone would have to contribute. At just 12 years old, Andrew dropped out of school after only 5 years of education. His childhood was over before it had truly begun. His first job was in a cotton mill, working 12 hours a day for $1.20 per week. His hands bled from operating the machinery, his lungs filled with cotton dust. But Andrew felt something his father never could: pride. That first paycheck, as meager as it was, represented power. It meant he could help his family, that he wasn't helpless anymore. Years later, Carnegie would reflect that no amount of money ever made him happier than that first $1.20. But Andrew was too ambitious to stay content with mill work. He became an engineer's assistant, stoking boilers in the textile factory. The pay was slightly better, but the job gave him nightmares. He'd wake up sweating, terrified that he'd been engulfed in flames from a factory explosion. The fear drove him to find something better, and at 14, he landed a job as a messenger boy at a local telegraph office. This wasn't just any job, this was Andrew's Harvard Business School. Biking all over Pittsburgh to deliver telegrams, he had a front-row seat to how the city's business elite operated. He memorized names and faces like a human database, studying the powerful men who ran the railroads, the steel mills, the banks. When he saw these men on the street, he'd greet them by name, and slowly they began to notice the ambitious young messenger who always remembered their faces. His wages jumped to $2.50 per week, but more importantly, Andrew was building a network. And networks, he was learning, were more valuable than money. One man in particular took notice of the sharp young messenger, Thomas Scott, a regional manager for the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, the largest railroad in the country. Tom saw something of himself in Andrew. They'd both started poor, but both burned with an ambition that wouldn't be contained. Tom hired Andrew as his personal telegrapher and private secretary, and Andrew's wages jumped to $35 per month. But the real value wasn't the money, it was the education. Andrew was now watching firsthand how a major corporation operated, how deals were made, how power was wielded. Tom Scott became more than a boss. He became Andrew's mentor, the father figure who would teach him not just business, but how the game was really played. One day, Tom approached Andrew with a stock tip: buy shares in Adams Express. It shot up in value almost immediately, and Andrew experienced something revolutionary, making money without doing physical labor. This was blatant insider trading, of course, but Tom was teaching Andrew a fundamental principle: your money should work for you, not the other way around. It was a lesson that would shape everything Andrew did for the rest of his life. As Andrew continued to rise through the railroad ranks, aided by his mentor's guidance, he was becoming increasingly well off. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, Andrew had enough money to pay a substitute to take his place on the battlefield. While other young men died in muddy trenches, Andrew stayed safely in Pittsburgh, building his fortune and his network. But in 1865, tragedy struck. Andrew came home from work to find his mother crying. His father had died at 51, a broken man crushed by forces beyond his control. As Andrew stood over his father's grave, he made two promises that would define the rest of his life. He would become rich enough that his family would never suffer again, and he would become powerful enough that no one could ever break him the way his father had been broken. He vowed to his weeping mother that he would take care of her, and though he said it with conviction, neither of them could have possibly guessed just how far he would go to keep that promise. Chapter 3. The Steel King rises by 30. Andrew was making over $50,000 a year, a fortune by the standards of the time. But he was always looking for the next opportunity, the next way to climb higher. He saw the future in iron bridges to replace the wooden structures that constantly collapsed and burned. So he left the Pennsylvania Railroad and moved to New York City with his mother, finally able to give her the luxury she deserved. Andrew began managing the Keystone Bridge Company, but he didn't just build bridges. He applied the lessons Tom Scott had taught him about vertical integration. Instead of buying iron from suppliers, he built his own iron mills. This gave him control over every aspect of production and allowed him to undercut his competitors' prices. Combined with his railroad connections, Andrew was soon dominating the bridge market. Then came the opportunity that would change everything: building the largest rail and road bridge in America, spanning over a mile across the Mississippi River. This bridge would connect east and west like never before, revolutionizing American commerce. But there was a problem. No existing material was strong enough to withstand the Mississippi's current. They would need steel, but steel was expensive and difficult to produce in large quantities. It was used for small items like cutlery and jewelry, but never for massive structures. Andrew became obsessed with the idea. He stood on the banks of the Mississippi, envisioning his creation. Knowing that big rewards required big risks, he traveled across the country, visiting steel mills and talking to chemists, learning everything he could about steel production. For months, it seemed hopeless, until someone introduced him to Henry Bessemer, an English inventor who had created a revolutionary new method for refining steel. The Bessemer converter was a pear-shaped furnace that could mass-produce steel on a scale never seen before. It cut the time to manufacture a single steel rail from 2 weeks to 15 minutes, something previously thought impossible. This was exactly what Andrew needed, but it would require an enormous investment that few entrepreneurs were willing to make. Andrew saw the potential and bet everything he had on this new technology. After securing additional investors and years of grueling work, the bridge over the Mississippi River was completed. the first steel structure of its size in history. But there was one problem: nobody believed it was safe. Bridge collapses were common, and people had never seen anything this massive. Andrew needed to prove his bridge wouldn't kill anyone who used it. At the time, there was a popular superstition that elephants wouldn't walk across unstable foundations. So on opening day, with crowds gathered to see what would happen, Andrew arranged for a circus elephant to lead a parade across the bridge. When the elephant crossed successfully, the crowd followed, and the Eads Bridge was officially open for business. The bridge still stands today, a testament to Carnegie Steel and Andrew's understanding of public psychology. But Andrew was no longer thinking just about bridges. With his steel mill capable of producing massive quantities of high-quality steel, it was time to think much bigger. The railroads were eager to replace their iron rails and bridges with stronger steel, and Andrew had positioned himself to supply an entire nation's hunger for progress. Chapter 4: The Price of Empire. Andrew's first steel mill wasn't named after himself. In a strategic move that revealed his understanding of power, he called it the Edgar Thomson Steel Works, after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. This wasn't humility, it was calculation. By naming his mill after one of the most influential men in the railroad business, Andrew was publicly declaring his allegiance to his biggest potential customers. The strategy worked immediately. Edgar Thomson himself ordered 2,000 steel rails from Andrew's company. Andrew's ability to produce affordable steel came from one source: ruthless efficiency. His motto was, "Watch the costs and the profits take care of themselves," and he applied this philosophy with mathematical precision to every aspect of his operation. Unfortunately, the biggest cost was always labor, and cutting labor costs meant extracting maximum value from every worker. Andrew's employees worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They received exactly one holiday per year, the 4th of July. Every other day was grinding, dangerous work in conditions that would horrify modern observers. Workers weren't provided with adequate protective equipment because safety measures cost money. Injuries were common, deaths were routine, and Andrew viewed both as acceptable costs of doing business. The statistics were staggering. 9% of all steelworkers died on the job industry-wide, but Carnegie's mills, driven by their obsession with efficiency, were among the most dangerous. Countless workers suffered devastating injuries from molten steel, machinery accidents, and toxic fumes. But Andrew had designed his production system to use unskilled laborers doing repetitive tasks, so the workforce was easily replaceable. When workers were injured or killed, new ones were quickly hired to take their place. Andrew deliberately fostered competition between workers, pitting them against each other to produce record amounts of steel. When they succeeded, their new production levels became the standard quota expected every week. Those who couldn't maintain the pace were fired. Employee turnover was deliberately high because desperate workers were cheaper workers, and desperate workers didn't organize unions. Despite the human cost, Andrew's system was undeniably effective. His mills became some of the most productive in the world, capable of rolling out 225 tons of steel per day. Carnegie Steel was fueling America's growth, providing the raw material for the nation's expansion and making Andrew incredibly wealthy in the process. Even as he demanded frugality from his workers, Andrew was willing to spend enormous sums on anything that improved efficiency. When new technology became available, he would immediately replace entire departments or processes if it meant higher productivity. He installed overhead cranes and hoists, upgraded furnaces, and constantly sought ways to automate processes that had previously required human workers. Machines didn't need sleep, didn't demand raises, and didn't form unions. Andrew's strategy of vertical integration continued to expand. He wanted to control every step of the steel-making process, from the raw materials to the finished products to their transportation. By controlling the entire supply chain, he could cut costs even further and maintain his competitive advantage. Interestingly, at age 33, Andrew wrote himself a letter vowing to retire in 2 years and devote his life to benevolent purposes. He wrote that, "Simply making more money must degrade me beyond hope of permanent recovery." It was a moment of self-awareness that suggested Andrew understood the moral cost of his success. But 2 years later, Andrew wasn't just still working, he was about to become more controversial than ever before. Chapter 5. The Rockefeller War disaster struck Andrew's empire when his biggest customer, the railroad industry, began facing catastrophic problems. Railroads had been built so rapidly that too many lines were competing for the same business. When the stock market crashed and economic activity slowed, the railroads suddenly didn't have enough revenue to sustain themselves. For Andrew, whose business model depended on selling massive quantities of steel, this meant orders dried up almost overnight. But one man saw opportunity in the railroad's desperation: John D. Rockefeller, the oil magnate who had built Standard Oil into a monopolistic empire. Knowing how desperately the railroads needed cargo, Rockefeller negotiated massive discounts for shipping his oil. The railroads, desperate for any revenue, initially agreed, but the discounts were so steep they became unsustainable. When the railroads tried to renegotiate, Rockefeller refused and pulled his oil shipments entirely. Since Rockefeller was one of their biggest customers, this decision pushed many rail companies into bankruptcy. Among those most affected was Andrew's old mentor, Tom Scott, who had invested heavily in multiple struggling railroads. Facing financial ruin, Tom approached his former protege for help. The man who had given Andrew his start, who had taught him everything about business, was now asking Andrew to invest in his company to prevent bankruptcy. Andrew turned him down. He claimed all his money was tied up in manufacturing, but the truth was more complex. Andrew had learned from Tom that business was about cold calculation, not sentiment. Helping Tom would have been financially risky, and Andrew had promised himself he would never be vulnerable again. Tom left devastated, his business never recovered, and he died not long after. As Andrew stood at Tom Scott's grave in 1881, rain pouring down on the funeral service, he faced a terrible truth. His refusal to help had contributed to his mentor's death. But rather than accept responsibility, Andrew found a scapegoat. He convinced himself that Rockefeller was responsible for Tom's death, that Rockefeller's manipulation of the railroads had killed the man who meant more to Andrew than anyone else in the business world. Whether this was genuine belief or psychological self-protection, it created a rivalry that would define both men for years to come. Andrew wanted revenge against the king of oil, and he was determined to become wealthier than Rockefeller as a form of vengeance for his mentor's death. The rivalry between Carnegie and Rockefeller became legendary, extending even to passive-aggressive Christmas gifts. One year, Rockefeller sent Andrew a cheap paper vest, mocking his origins as a poor immigrant. Andrew retaliated by sending Rockefeller a bottle of fine whiskey, knowing that as a devout Baptist, Rockefeller completely abstained from alcohol and couldn't even give the gift away without compromising his religious principles. But the competition spurred both men to greater ambitions. With the railroad industry struggling, Andrew pivoted to a new market he saw emerging: urban construction. Unemployed Americans were flooding into cities like Chicago and New York, searching for work and opportunity. These growing cities needed more buildings, and steel would allow them to build taller, stronger structures than ever before. Andrew's steel company began supplying materials for tens of thousands of skyscrapers, fundamentally changing the American landscape. Cities reached toward the sky on foundations of Carnegie steel, and Andrew's profits soared accordingly. He was making over $1.5 million per year, but his personal fortune was still smaller than Rockefeller's. Andrew needed a way to become even more profitable, and he knew exactly the man who could help him achieve that goal. The problem was that this partnership would lead to the darkest chapter of his career, with consequences that would haunt his legacy forever. Chapter 6. Enter the Devil. To help run his expanding steel empire, Andrew brought in Henry Clay Frick, another industrialist with a reputation as a cutthroat executive known for his ruthlessness. Frick had set a goal of becoming a millionaire by age 30 and had achieved it through sheer force of will and complete disregard for anyone who stood in his way. Where Andrew was thin-skinned and concerned about his public image, Frick was merciless and didn't care what anyone thought of him. Andrew believed a partnership with Frick would give his company the edge needed to completely dominate the steel industry. Some questioned giving Frick so much power, but he immediately proved his worth through fear and intimidation. Frick renegotiated supplier contracts, often threatening suppliers' other business relationships if they didn't agree to Carnegie's terms. He eliminated waste through methods that would have been politically impossible for Andrew to implement directly. Most importantly, Frick served as a shield for Andrew's reputation. When unpopular decisions needed to be made, cutting wages, extending working hours, breaking up unions, it was Frick who delivered the news and Frick who took the blame. This allowed Andrew to maintain his carefully cultivated image as a reasonable businessman, while Frick handled the dirty work of keeping costs low and workers compliant. Frick had a particular talent for destroying unions and preventing workers from organizing. Most of Carnegie's steel mills operated without unions, and Frick's reputation for crushing labor organization was so fearsome that workers often didn't even attempt to organize. When they did, Frick's network of informants would alert management before any real organizing could take place. One example of their combined ruthlessness was their systematic destruction of Duquesne Steelworks, a rival company that had begun beating Carnegie at his own game. Duquesne was using innovative technology to cut costs and was becoming serious competition. Rather than compete fairly, Andrew and Frick decided to destroy them through deception. They spread rumors that Duquesne was producing defective steel, circulating warnings to railroads about the supposed lack of homogeneity in Duquesne's products. Nobody knew what this term actually meant, but it sounded technical and dangerous enough to frighten customers away. The rumors were completely fabricated, but they achieved their purpose. Duquesne's sales plummeted. Andrew then temporarily undercut Duquesne's pricing, accepting losses on orders if it meant stealing customers and accelerating his competitors' financial collapse. Within a year, Duquesne was bankrupt and Frick negotiated a deal to buy their steelworks at a bargain price. Once they owned Duquesne, they implemented the exact same cost-cutting techniques they had previously warned customers not to trust. This was just one example of Andrew and Frick's willingness to do whatever it took to win. The partnership was incredibly profitable. Their combined ruthlessness nearly doubled profits in their first year together. By ramping up production and slashing costs through any means necessary, they had the capital to buy out other competitors and open new mills, which only increased Andrew's personal fortune. By this point, Andrew would have been a billionaire in today's money, but his relationship with Henry Frick would soon result in controversies that would forever tarnish the reputation he had worked so hard to build. The first disaster came when Frick decided to create an exclusive retreat for the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country. Chapter 7. The Dam of Greed. Frick purchased land in the hills of Pittsburgh and built a private club for about 50 of the country's wealthiest industrialists, bankers, and influential people. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was designed as an exclusive retreat where the ultra-rich could relax away from the masses, and the most prominent member was Frick's partner, Andrew Carnegie. The club wanted their own private lake for fishing, so they took control of the South Fork Dam, the largest earthen dam in the country, holding back 20 million tons of water. Just 14 miles downstream was the working-class town of Johnstown, home to steelworkers and their families, the very people whose labor had built the fortunes of the club members above them. The club's modifications to the dam were guided by luxury, not safety. They leveled off the top to make room for a road, lowered the dam by several feet to create better lake levels for their activities, and removed key safety features that interfered with their recreational plans. When local officials begged them to strengthen the dam and warned of the dangers, the club dismissed their concerns. They were more interested in perfecting their fishing and hunting paradise than in engineering safety. The club members lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege, completely disconnected from the working families below the dam. They hosted elaborate parties, fished in their private lake, and hunted in their private forests. While just downstream, families lived paycheck to paycheck in a town that existed to serve their industrial empires. On May 31, 1889, after days of heavy rain, the inevitable happened. The dam gave way, sending a wall of water racing toward Johnstown at speeds reaching 40 miles per hour. The flood destroyed everything in its path. Homes, businesses, schools, churches. Entire families were swept away in seconds. 2,209 people died, including 400 children. Bodies were found scattered for hundreds of miles, some as far as Cincinnati. Families were completely wiped out, leaving no one to even mourn their deaths. The Johnstown flood became the worst man-made disaster in United States history up to that point. The club used their wealth and connections to avoid accountability. They hired the best lawyers, influenced investigations, and ensured that no legal responsibility was assigned to them for the dam's failure. Despite clear evidence that their modifications had weakened the structure, no member of the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club ever paid a penny in compensation to the victims' families. Andrew Carnegie was the most prominent member of this club, and while there's no evidence he was directly involved in the dam modifications, he helped sweep the entire incident under the rug to protect Frick and, by extension, himself. His close association with the club and his efforts to minimize the disaster's impact on the wealthy members significantly damaged his public reputation. The public was outraged that an ultra-wealthy club's negligent pursuit of luxury had caused such massive loss of life among working-class families. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The wealthy literally lived above the workers, and their careless pursuit of pleasure had sent death crashing down on the people below. For Andrew, the Johnstown disaster was just the beginning. His partnership with Frick was about to lead to an even darker chapter, one that would involve industrial warfare, private armies, and blood flowing in the streets of Pennsylvania. Chapter 8. Homestead. The battle for America's soul. Unrest was brewing among Andrew's workers, and it was reaching a breaking point. They felt like wage slaves with no chance of advancement, watching Andrew's fortune grow rapidly while they struggled to survive on poverty wages. What made their situation even more infuriating was Andrew's public hypocrisy. He wrote essays championing workers' rights and the importance of unions, while privately, his company did everything possible to crush any organizing efforts. Andrew loved playing the role of the enlightened industrialist. He built a library near his Edgar Thomson steelworks, claiming it was for his employees, but the reality was that his workers labored such long hours they never had time to use it. Many of the unskilled laborers couldn't even read. The library was more about Andrew's self-image than actually helping his workers. If he truly cared about them, he would have provided the raises and safety measures they desperately needed, not a building they couldn't use. Andrew had mastered the art of public relations while letting Frick handle the brutal realities of labor management. He would open libraries with elaborate ceremonies and write inspiring essays about workers' dignity, while Frick cut wages, extended hours, and intimidated anyone who tried to organize for better conditions. But trouble was brewing at Homestead, another steel plant Andrew had acquired and heavily expanded. Unlike his other mills, Homestead still had workers who belonged to the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. Their contract was approaching renewal, and given the steel industry's profitability, the union wanted to negotiate for wage increases and improve safety conditions. Andrew had no intention of granting either request. Instead, he suggested he might build a library near the Homestead plant if the workers proved to be good partners, code for abandoning their union affiliation. As contract negotiations approached, Andrew put Frick in charge of handling the union, telling him he had full support to do whatever was necessary, but Andrew also wanted plausible deniability for whatever might happen. In May 1892, he conveniently took a long vacation to Scotland, leaving Homestead entirely in Frick's hands. Andrew knew exactly how aggressive Frick could be and how ugly the dispute might become, so he positioned himself thousands of miles away where he could claim ignorance of any controversial decisions. Before leaving for Scotland, Andrew gave Frick two key instructions: crush the union at any cost and increase production levels dramatically before the contract expired to stockpile materials in case of a strike. Frick began pushing the workers harder than ever, extending already dangerous working hours despite the fact that exhausted employees in a steel mill environment led to more injuries and deaths. Industry-wide, an estimated 9% of steel workers died on the job, but at Homestead, workers were being pushed beyond their limits. They were spending half their lives in dreadful conditions for wages that barely kept their families fed, watching colleagues suffer accidents or die, working longer hours with no pay increases while the plant's profits soared. When contract negotiations began, the union asked for modest wage increases and basic safety improvements. Frick's response was brutal: a 22% wage decrease and immediate dissolution of the union as a condition of continued employment. The workers couldn't believe what they were hearing. They knew how profitable the plant was, yet they were being told to work more hours for less money when they were already struggling to survive. The workers tried to contact Andrew directly, reasoning that since he publicly supported unions and workers' rights, surely he wouldn't allow Frick to implement such draconian terms. But Andrew was conveniently unreachable from his Scottish castle, at least to workers and the press. However, he maintained regular communication with Frick, writing letters that made his position crystal clear. "Mr. Frick, no doubt you will get Homestead right. You can get anything right with your mild persistence. We all approve of anything you do. We are with you to the end." When the union refused to accept wage cuts and the elimination of their organization, Frick announced he would no longer negotiate with the union and would only deal with individual workers. The union said they were willing to compromise on most other issues but insisted on maintaining their right to organize. Frick had no interest in compromise. He wanted total victory. On June 29th, on direct orders from Andrew, Frick locked the workers out of the steel mill. Both Andrew and Frick believed the workers would quickly surrender when faced with no income, agreed to disband their union, and return to work under Frick's terms. They had prepared for a brief shutdown by stockpiling materials through the previous months of intensified production. But they had underestimated the workers' unity and desperation. Instead of capitulating, thousands of Homestead workers went on strike and barricaded themselves around the steelworks, preventing Frick from bringing in replacement workers. Steel production remained halted as the plant was surrounded by determined strikers who felt they had nothing left to lose. Frick's response escalated the conflict to a level nobody had anticipated. He hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency, essentially a private mercenary army, to escort replacement workers to the factory and break the strike through force. On July 6, 1892, 300 armed Pinkerton agents arrived on barges crossing the Monongahela River, carrying weapons and orders to retake the Homestead steel mill. When workers stationed along the river spotted the approaching force, they alerted the strikers, who rushed to find whatever weapons they could: stones, clubs, knives, anything that might help them defend their position. As the Pinkertons reached the shore, striking workers pleaded with them to turn back, warning that violence was inevitable if they tried to land. But the Pinkertons had their orders from Frick, and those orders were clear: take back control of Homestead by any means necessary. What happened next became known as the Battle of Homestead, and it would stain American labor history with blood. Historians still debate who fired the first shot, but within minutes, the area around the steel mill erupted in violence. Workers rolled burning freight cars toward the Pinkerton barges, threw dynamite into the river to sink the boats, and pumped oil into the water trying to set it ablaze. The Pinkertons responded with gunfire, and for 12 brutal hours, the battle raged. 9 Homestead workers were killed, 7 Pinkerton agents died, and dozens more on both sides were wounded. The Monongahela River ran red with blood as families fought for their livelihoods against a private army hired by one of the richest men in the world. When the fighting finally stopped, it was the Pinkertons who surrendered. The workers had managed to hold their ground against overwhelming odds, and for a moment it seemed like they had won. But their victory was short-lived. Chapter 9. The reckoning news of the violence at Homestead spread across the country, and the Pennsylvania governor sent 8,000 state militia troops to restore order. But order meant breaking the strike and reopening the mill for Carnegie Steel. The workers, vastly outnumbered by professional soldiers, were forced to abandon their positions. Frick was able to reopen the steel works with replacement workers, and many of the original Homestead employees found themselves permanently locked out of their jobs. Some were allowed to return, but only at lower wages, longer hours, and under contracts that forever banned union membership. The Homestead strike's failure would prevent steelworkers from organizing for another 45 years. From an economic perspective, Andrew had achieved exactly what he wanted. He had broken the union, reduced labor costs, and demonstrated to workers at his other plants what would happen if they tried to organize. But the public relations cost was devastating. The American people were outraged by the violence. Andrew was dubbed the arch-sneak of this age by newspapers, while others called him a coward for hiding in Scotland while sending others to do his dirty work. His carefully cultivated image as a benevolent industrialist was shattered. replaced by the perception of a man who would hire private armies to shoot his own workers. Andrew extended his stay in Scotland, hoping the controversy would fade, but the damage to his reputation was permanent. In his autobiography, he claimed complete innocence, insisting he had no idea what Frick would do and taking no responsibility for the deaths. He wrote that, "Nothing in all my life before or since wounded me so deeply," and portrayed himself as much a victim as the dead workers. He maintained that, had I been there, the tragedy would not have occurred, suggesting that his absence was coincidental rather than a calculated attempt to avoid responsibility. But the evidence told a different story. Multiple letters clearly showed Andrew was aware of Frick's plans and had repeatedly given him approval to do whatever was necessary to break the union. While Andrew may not have intended for people to die, he knew exactly what kind of man Frick was and what methods he would use. He could have stopped the escalation at any point, but chose instead to encourage Frick with messages like, "Never employ one of these rioters, must not fail now." The Homestead tragedy also marked the beginning of the end for Andrew's partnership with Frick. As public criticism mounted, Andrew began distancing himself from his partner, suggesting in newspaper interviews that if he had been present, none of the violence would have occurred. The clear implication was that Frick was solely responsible for what happened. Frick was furious when he realized Andrew was trying to make him the scapegoat for decisions they had made together. He told reporters he was sick of Carnegie's hypocritical articles and absurd interviews, and asked why Andrew wasn't manly enough to say to my face what he said behind my back. Their relationship deteriorated rapidly through a series of business disputes, ultimately leading to Frick's resignation as chief executive. But even after leaving day-to-day operations, Frick owned significant shares in the company, and Andrew tried to buy him out at below-market rates. Frick accused Andrew of being a thief and sued for the full value of his holdings. The lawsuit became one of the most high-profile corporate battles in American history, revealing for the first time just how profitable Carnegie Steel had become. The company was making around $40 million annually, equivalent to $1.4 billion today. Andrew and Frick had deliberately kept these numbers secret to avoid criticism from politicians and union leaders. To avoid further embarrassing revelations in court, Andrew agreed to buy out Frick for $31.6 million. Frick withdrew his lawsuit and gave up any management role in the company, but their personal animosity continued for the rest of their lives. Frick seemed to enjoy taunting Andrew from a distance, sending mocking messages about his business decisions and even commissioning a building right next to one of Andrew's, making sure his building was taller so that Andrew's would literally be in its shadow. The two men who had once dominated American industry together had ended their partnership in mutual hatred, each feeling betrayed by the other. But for Andrew, the end of his relationship with Frick coincided with an opportunity that would make him the richest man in the world. Chapter 10. Blood Money Philanthropy. Despite the controversies, Andrew's steel empire continued to thrive. By the turn of the 20th century, Carnegie Steel produced more steel than the entire country of Great Britain. Andrew, now approaching 70, was ready to step back from business. His wife desperately wanted him to sell the company so they could spend their remaining years together without the constant demands of managing a massive industrial empire. The problem was finding someone wealthy enough to buy Carnegie Steel. One man showed serious interest: J.P. Morgan, the legendary financier who had used the railroad industry's troubles to build his own empire by buying undervalued companies and merging them into dominant corporations. Morgan had conquered the railroad business and now wanted to dominate steel, but his plants couldn't match Carnegie's efficiency or low costs. Rather than compete, Morgan decided his best strategy was to buy Andrew out entirely. The deal was brokered by Charles Schwab, who had replaced Frick as president of Carnegie Steel. In 1901, Morgan asked Andrew to name his price for the entire company. Andrew wrote on a piece of paper, $480 million, equivalent to approximately $17 billion today. Morgan glanced at the number and agreed immediately, without negotiation or hesitation. When Andrew wondered aloud if he could have asked for $100 million more, Morgan replied that if he had, he would have gotten it. It was the largest business transaction in American history. Morgan combined Carnegie's company with several other steel firms to create U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Meanwhile, the sale made Andrew Carnegie the richest man in the world. The boy born into poverty in Scotland, who had dropped out of school at 12 and started working in a cotton mill, had reached the absolute pinnacle of financial success. But what was he going to do with all that money? And more importantly, could money wash away the blood on his hands? Andrew's answer was philanthropy on a scale the world had never seen. After selling his steel empire, he made giving away his fortune his full-time job. But Andrew didn't believe in simple charity. He felt that just handing people money wouldn't actually improve their lives. Instead, his focus was on education, the force he credited with his own rise from poverty. He established over 2,500 libraries across the world, along with museums, schools, and universities. Carnegie Mellon University still bears his name today. To his credit, this wasn't pure self-promotion. Only about 500 of the libraries carried his name, while the rest were simply funded by his grants. Similarly, Carnegie Hall was originally just called the Music Hall when Andrew donated it in 1891. It was only named after him posthumously. Andrew didn't believe in passing wealth to future generations, feeling that inherited fortunes were squandered by heirs who hadn't earned them. The parent who leaves his son enormous wealth generally deadens the talents and energies of the son, he wrote. While he ensured his family would be comfortable, he didn't leave them vast riches. By his death, Andrew had given away over $350 million, and he created the Carnegie Corporation to distribute the remainder of his wealth after he was gone. The foundation continues its philanthropic work today. In his final years, he even tried to prevent World War I, attempting to bribe world leaders to maintain peace and establish international cooperation. So, how should we judge Andrew Carnegie? Many view his philanthropy cynically, seeing it as guilt money, an attempt to atone for the Johnstown flood, the Homestead Massacre, and the countless workers who died in his mills. Others believe it was about legacy management, ensuring his name would be remembered fondly rather than as a symbol of industrial brutality. Some think his rivalry with Rockefeller extended to their charitable giving, that they were competing to see who could give away more money and be remembered as the greater philanthropist. All of these motivations may have played a role, but it seems likely that Andrew also genuinely wanted to help people. He often repeated that, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced," and wrote in The Gospel of Wealth about the wealthy's obligation to use their fortunes to improve society. Andrew is often credited with establishing the precedent for corporate philanthropy, inspiring future billionaires to consider their responsibility to give back. Andrew undoubtedly did tremendous good for humanity, first by revolutionizing steel production and helping build modern America, then by funding education and cultural institutions that benefited millions. His donations toward education have helped countless people improve their lives and circumstances. But does that make up for everything else? The workers who died building his fortune, the families destroyed at Homestead, the children killed at Johnstown? Andrew may have believed that the ends justified the means, that building a fortune through brutal methods was acceptable if that fortune was then used to help humanity. It's possible he calculated that without his ruthless efficiency, a more brutal businessman would have dominated the steel industry and kept all the profits for himself. In Andrew's mind, perhaps the temporary suffering of his workers was the price for the permanent benefits his philanthropy would provide, but there's no denying the complexity of his legacy. Andrew Carnegie simultaneously did more good and caused more harm than almost any individual in American history. He was both the greatest philanthropist and one of the most ruthless industrialists of his era. Chapter 11. The Ultimate Sale. The $480 million sale to J.P. Morgan represented more than just a business transaction. It was the completion of Andrew's transformation from powerless immigrant to the most powerful industrialist in the world. But even in his moment of ultimate triumph, questions lingered about the price of his success. Morgan's immediate acceptance of Andrew's asking price revealed just how valuable Carnegie Steel had become. The company wasn't just profitable, it was an industrial empire that controlled American infrastructure development. Every skyscraper, every bridge, every railroad expansion depended on Carnegie Steel. When Morgan combined Carnegie's company with other steel firms to create U.S. Steel, he wasn't just creating a corporation, he was establishing American industrial dominance on the global stage. The merger represented the consolidation of power that would define American capitalism for generations. For Andrew, the sale meant freedom from the daily moral compromises that business required. No more decisions about worker safety versus profits, no more union battles, no more responsibility for the human cost of industrial efficiency. He could finally become the benevolent figure he had always wanted to be. But the sale also represented a kind of admission. By walking away from business at the height of his success, Andrew was acknowledging that he couldn't continue operating in that world without continuing to cause harm. The fortune he had built required methods he was no longer willing to employ. The irony wasn't lost on observers at the time. The man who had spent decades arguing that business success required ruthless efficiency was now arguing that wealth carried moral obligations. The same person who had justified worker exploitation as economic necessity was now claiming that the wealthy had a duty to help the less fortunate. Epilogue: Hell's Waiting Room. In his final years, as Andrew devoted himself to philanthropy and peacemaking, he attempted one last reconciliation. Knowing that both he and Henry Frick were aging, Andrew sent a messenger to his former partner with a proposal. Since they were both growing old, wouldn't it make sense to put their past grievances behind them and meet in person? Frick read Andrew's letter and told the messenger, "Yes, you can tell Carnegie I'll meet him." Then he threw the letter away in disgust and added, "Tell Carnegie I'll meet him in hell, since that's where we're both going." It was a perfect summary of their relationship and perhaps of Andrew's entire life. Even Frick, the man who had carried out Andrew's most brutal orders, recognized that their actions had damned them both. There would be no forgiveness, no redemption, no final reconciliation between the two men who had built an empire on other people's suffering. Andrew Carnegie's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about success, morality, and redemption. Can you build something good from something evil? Does philanthropic generosity excuse industrial brutality? Is it possible to atone for systematic harm through systematic charity? Carnegie believed the answer was yes, that his libraries and universities justified the methods he used to fund them. Frick's final rejection suggests a different conclusion, that some sins are too great for earthly redemption, that the blood spilled in pursuit of profit can't be washed away by charitable donations. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Andrew Carnegie was neither pure villain nor pure hero, but a complex figure whose legacy embodies the contradictions of American capitalism itself. He proved that it was possible to rise from poverty to unimaginable wealth, but also demonstrated the human cost of that ascent. His story continues to echo in every boardroom decision about worker safety versus profits, in every debate about wealth inequality, in every billionaire's announcement of philanthropic intentions. Carnegie's final lesson may be that the American dream, while real and achievable, comes with a price that extends far beyond the dreamer. The question each generation must answer is whether that price is worth paying, and who gets to make that decision. So, was Carnegie a hero who lifted himself from poverty to help millions, or a villain who built his empire on blood and bones? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, like this video if you enjoyed this deep dive into America's most controversial tycoon, and subscribe because we're just getting started with these incredible stories.